So Scott, you wanted to hear about my Norway trip, huh? Oh my God.
Are you up for that, George?
Oh, I am.
was
And you
just
guys, of course,
really
the rest of you
enjoying.
can say goodbye anytime you like. There it is. Here's the name of the farms that I went to. And you see Lillehammer at the south end. And going north from there, our ancestral start right around Trenton. A lot of them are concentrated in Fovang, and also there's a couple in Ringaboo, and then a big concentration in Sorfrone or South Frone. It's 2011, 10 years ago this year in August. We flew into Oslo and we stayed with Myrna's daughter, Anne, and her family. Wonderful people. We spent a total of 3 weeks in Norway. About 5 days of that, we went up to Lillehammer and rented a car and drove throughout this region of Gudbrandsdal where all the ancestral sites are.
You remember what you were feeling as you were coming into Norway and getting closer to?
I was just really excited because I'd studied Google Maps, as you can tell from this map at the top. I'd studied Google Maps and I had the locations of all these farms, which I didn't even really need because I had Paul and also Knut, who guided me around to all these sites. I'd done all this homework, and so yeah, I was super excited. I have my own car and drive wherever I wanted to all these sites. There's Paul Hjorstad, the guy who is not a relative, except he is. Now we found out we're DNA relatives, and we can't figure out how. But anyway, we didn't even think we were related at the time, but he was just so gracious, spent a whole day driving around with me, and also emailed before and after all kinds of information. So it was really great to meet him and his family. The Sorfrone Church, a couple of gravestones that are not of relatives, but they are people with the name of farms that I was interested in.
Yes.
I did know some of the history of Lars Paulson and knew the name of the farm where he was born and the location. And this is it here, the roadway leading up to it. Fairly old house, not that old, but the only building still standing on the land.
Now you're seeing some of your own family history.
Right, right. The history that no one in my generation or the last generation or two actually knew much about. The very steep pastures on this farm was what really, really impressed me. It's hard to imagine farming on land this steep.
Yeah.
Is Lars Paulson about as far back as we can research?
It would be, except for an interesting fact, which is that his father owned this very small farm called Flata. So his name was in the farm books, even though the church books had burnt up and anything before this was not available in this particular line, Lars Paulson's ancestry. I was able to go back several generations further, in fact, because he was in another set of documents. But there's an old, an even older barn, maybe even from the middle of the 19th century, still not from the early 19th probably, and an old wall of an underground barn or storage shed that was caved in.
Wow.
And that may have been old enough for Lars Paulson to actually have seen it as a small child. But it would have only been as a small child because Lars's father died when he was 3 years old. He was almost bankrupt at the time, and so the family lost the farm, and Lars had to leave at an early age. Sjordal was the second farm of interest. This is all the sub-farms listed for Sjordal. One of the minor ones was David Haugen, where Anna and Lars Paulson actually lived in his adult life. There's another picture, the David Haugen farm. This shows you the modern buildings on the farm from the gate because we weren't allowed on the property. Here's the picture of that one little outbuilding, which reminded me of a Husman's house, and I showed you in my talk a couple of months ago. It's called David Haugen because the first settler there was actually Anna Larsdottir's grandfather, David Johnson, who settled there in the middle 1700s. Again, Paul Kjorstad had studied this family for another descendant, so he was quite familiar with it. Even he could not tell me where David Johnson came from. He thought it was a nearby parish, probably up the river, but he really didn't know. The first place I visited was Trenton area. In fact, we stayed at the Glomstad farm. Myrna, I think you're familiar with that.
Yes, I am.
Myrna and Lois stayed there when they visited the area.
And met Joyce and Linda and their husbands there.
Right, right.
And yeah, and then your mom and Vernon and Audrey stayed there when they traveled to Norway too.
Oh, I don't think I was even aware of that until right now, Myrna. Thank you for that.
Okay, and then one of the times that I was in Norway, actually, Ode Irene, who is almost 17, was just a baby, so about 17 years ago.
Uh-huh.
Anne and Ode Irene and I went up there from Oslo and spent 2 nights just for a getaway. Been there a few times.
Yeah. Well, and the nice lady that runs it, who met all of you folks and met us, I doubt if she's still there. She was really already kind of wanting to retire, but nobody was in line to take it over.
So that's a bed and breakfast.
A bed and breakfast, yeah, a rather large one, yeah. It's the buildings in the background are actually the bed and breakfast itself. But here's a view from we walked down to the road from the bed and breakfast, and you could see a whole bunch of the valley because they were way up on the hill. But there at the bed and breakfast, waiting for us when we got there that evening, was Knut Granflaten, who is another very distant by marriage relative maybe, but he'd been a guide for some other folks up there, including Oren Moen. And he took me right up to the church there at Fulvang. It's a sub-parish of the Ringaboo parish, actually, Fulvang Church. And that's a pretty famous place in our family. The grandfather of Anna Moen actually built that stone fence. And right behind me and Knut there is the cornerstone of the fence around that church, the stone fence.
Oh, yeah.
It's got the initials TGS carved into a concrete face there. You can almost see him in the background.
Wow, cool.
That's for Torger Gunderson Stenumgardsklaven. And that was actually also Torger Gunderson Moen when he immigrated to Coon Prairie, Wisconsin. So our great grandfather who immigrated to Wisconsin is the person who built that wall. Knut picked up a little plank off of that fence, which I keep as a paperweight.
Yeah.
Oh,
A stone that was probably touched by our great grandfather.
Cool.
But in this parish of Fulvang is the farm of Bjerke, which is the birthplace of Anna Samuelsdottir, Ole Larson's mother. Anna Samuelsdottir was born here at Bjerke. And we took some photographs. This was South Bjerke. Interesting, you can see the fields there, a house in the background. One of these outbuildings, I guess that could have been a rude house of some kind for a husman itself. I'm not sure. A little later, we went across the river to another farm and took a picture across the river. Way back up there in the background is the Bjerke farm, where these upper photographs were taken. And there was the Ode Garden Farm. That's where Anna Samuelsdottir's mother was born. I had done this research at home, so I was able, with Knut's help, to find these places. The farmer there was very friendly, and he showed us a picture of a woman with a very similar name to one of our ancestors, but she's not. She was living at that farm in the 1800s. There's an old building on that farm, one that was occupied until the 1990s, and another wall of an underground structure, which is probably as old as those ancestors. Now to clarify the relationships a little bit, I put this part of the family tree up so you can see all these different names I'm talking about. Of course, we all know Isaac and Anna, our grandparents, and then there's their parents, Ole and Anna Samuelsdottir, and then there's Anna's parents, Gunder Torgerson Moen, and Anna's mother is Marie Amundsdottir Volden. So 3 out of those 4 great-grandparents were born in Norway. Only Marie was born after her parents immigrated. I actually went to sites over there that were associated with all these people: Lars Paulson, Anna Larsdottir, Samuel Jorgensen. He is Anna Samuelsdottir's father. Remember that, Samuel Jorgensen. There'll be a test later. And his wife, Marit Petersdottir from Glommy Ode Garden. Then there was Anna's grandparents, Torger Gunderson, Anna Hagensdottir, Amund Amundsen, and Anna Madsdottir. And as I toured Gudbrandsdal, We started up here in Sophrone Parish because I just wanted to get my primary people in first. And we talked about Flora, where Ole's father was born, and Shordal, where his mother was born and where he lived for his childhood. Then we went down and we started down in Tretton, where actually my tour physically started itself. And up in Sophrone, those two are Ole Larson's parents' place, okay? Down here in Tretton, we looked at these two farms, Bjerke and Ode Garden. Those are where, Bjerke is where Anna Samuel's daughter was born, and Ode Garden where her mother was born. And then we moved on up to Fovang Parish, and we looked at Hemrum Farm, where Anna Mullen's mother came from, and then we ran out of time.
What's the mileage between the Ole Larson site in the upper left and the Anna site down there?
Good question. It's 30 or 40 miles from one end of this ancestral area to the other. All eight of these ancestors came from this one 50-mile stretch of the Gudbrandsdal Valley. We drove up to Fovang and we drove to the Fovang church. It's a rather new church, only 150 years old. Pretty hardly even historical by those by standards back there. But the big draw there, of course, is this stone fence, which, as you remember, was built by TGS. If you see those initials up there, and who is that? No, that's a photobomb. But I'm talking about Torger Gunderson. We knew him as Torger Gunderson Moen in America. Torger moved around a lot himself. He was born at a farm called Opsal. Actually, this is the modern big house, but he was on a tenant farm called Opsal Haugen. Thiel and I drove around looking for a site that might have been Opsal Haugen, but didn't find anything. Generally, there's no trace of these tenant farms left. Next, he lived at Stenumgard, as in the initial on the fence. Stenumgard's Cleven, another tenant farm. Again, it's gone. And of course, these are modern homes I'm showing you, and it's also the modern landscape. You got to remember, a lot of the fields and farmland has gone back to forest now, and it's not really farming country anymore. There's a picture of Torger's wife, Anna. The last place that the two of them lived, and where actually our great-grandfather Gunder was born, was on the parent farm of Rorvik, and it's a tenant's farm called Rorviksmoen. Now that one's gone too, but Knut knew where it was, and he drove us there. It was a construction site. It had just been cleared to make a schoolyard for a new school that was going in. But Knut had some memories of that, and actually a photograph that he took that he gave me. And this is a picture of one of the buildings at Rorviksmoen 20 years earlier when Oren Moen was over there visiting. Knut took his picture and gave it to me, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
So from there, then we finished up at the Fovang Parish and we drove up back to Sophrone and I'll show you the last farm up there. But on our way was the historic Ringaboo Stave Church. Now this wooden church, we couldn't very well pass up stopping to look at it. It was built in the year 1250 and completed with the tower in 1631. So here, this wooden church, almost 900 years old, just blows my mind to think they're still having Sunday services there.
And which of our ancestors would have been part of this church?
None of these second great grandparents actually lived in this parish, would have attended this church regular. The Fovang Church is a sub-parish of Ringaboo, and so they may have gone there for special occasions. If we go back another generation or two, we start getting into ancestors who did live in Ringaboo. You've seen this church before, in some of my pictures at least. It's also quite old, not as old as Ringaboo, but as you can see there, it was dedicated in 1787, just a few years actually before Lars Paulsen was born, and he was most likely christened right in this church and buried here too. I'll talk about that at the end. Back to the map again so I can show you the farm we're going to look at now. It's Volden. It's where Marie Volden's parents came from. I put her name in parentheses because she's the only one of these four great-grandparents that was not born over there. Marie's father was born at Volden, but today there's a nice tidy little house in sort of a retro style. and just a wonderful woman living there named Bente Haberstad. She invited us in. She served us coffee and delicious waffles. Really quite wonderful. She didn't have much English, but two of her grandsons were there, so we were able to carry on quite a conversation. She actually grew up here at this farm and knows a lot of its history, several generations before her. She's not a known relative as far as I know, but she was so friendly. It was just great to meet her. Here's a view from her doorstep almost across the fields where this farm, this tenant farm was. At the time, it was a tenant farm under a large farm called Dalseg. This farm, Dalseg, was across the river. It could be this big one over here. This is where Amund was born, and as an old man, this is what he looked like. Father of Marie Volden Moen and grandfather of Anna Moen Larson. When he was born, this place was called Dalseg Volden, and that was his name on his birth record, Amundsen Dalseg Volden. His wife, Anna Haugen, came from the Haugen tenant farm, which is actually on the Sjurdal complex. Sjurdal was where Ole Larson grew up, so you're already familiar with that.
Now, George, did these folks immigrate to America?
Yes, yes.
And when?
Actually, Amund and Anne were the first of our family to immigrate to Coon Prairie, and I think it was 1857 or 1858. Our great-grandmother, Marie, was their third or fourth child. They had a couple of children before they immigrated.
Anna Moen Larson is our grandmother, right? That's
Correct.
Isaac's wife?
That's correct.
Okay.
And so this is her grandparents, her maternal grandparents. Now, Amund, he's got a rather interesting and scandalous story of his own. I'll save that for another share with you.
Oh, little teaser.
Yeah, that's the first of two teasers today, because Amund, he was an illegitimate child, and really quite a story behind it. Just to recap, we've looked in these two sessions at farms that were associated with all 8 of our great-grandparents on the Norwegian side. And only one of them died in Norway. That was our namesake, if you want to call it that, Lars Paulsen. And as we mentioned, he is undoubtedly buried in a now unmarked grave at Sorfron Church. Then second, there's his wife, Anna Larsdottir, buried at Brush Creek. There are Anna Samuelsdottir's parents, Samuel and Marit, at Brush Creek. Now, this is another interesting story. His name, remember what his name was in Norway, Samuel?
Samuel Jorgensen?
Jorgensen, Samuel Jorgensen. But when he was buried at Brush Creek, he was now Samuel Samuelson.
Huh.
I don't exactly know why, except that maybe his son, Ole Samuelson, came over first as a young adult, and also Anna, who married Ole, came over before the parents did. But I think Ole Samuelson was already established, and maybe they decided just to take that name.
Anna Larsdottir is the daughter of Lars Paulsen, correct?
No. Anna Larsdottir is the wife of Lars Paulsen.
So she came over by herself?
She came over with Ole and his 2 sisters.
Ah,
Oh, because Lars had already passed away.
Lars had died 10
And
years
she
earlier.
was
Okay.
probably 60 years old, wasn't she?
65. 65, pretty old in those days.
Yeah.
Poor all her life, probably skinny.
Yeah.
Must have been quite a trip. And she lived to
Yeah.
be almost 90.
Do we have any photographs of her?
No,
Okay.
she died in 1890, and I don't think they were taking too many photographs out in Brush Creek. And although the Larson boys, their earliest picture was in the 90s, but several years after Anna died. We don't even have any pictures of Ole Larson, even though he lived until 1908, the era of Brownie cameras. I believe it was shortly after Ole Larson died when Smith Larson must have got his Brownie camera and started taking pictures, which we do have some of. Going on with these great-great-grandparents, there's Torger and Anna Moen, married at Coon Prairie. Also, Amund and Marie Volden at Coon Prairie. That's almost all of my tour of Norway, but I really would like to show you some photos I took of a couple of farms going back some more generations. You see, because Lars Paulson happened to be born when his father owned some land, and so he's in the farm books. Lars's father is, and I could trace back some more generations. Got a couple more farms I took photos of, and finally one farm that I accidentally got a photo of, but I didn't know the story of yet. But that was the Bow farm, where lived Marty Ostin's daughter, our 6th great-grandmother, the famous murderer. So I've got a whole
Yes.
half hour's worth of her story to tell you at some future
We
time.
have a black sheep in the family.
And that is all I have to share with you today.
Oh,
Thank
thank you,
you.
George.
Thank you, George.
Yeah,
Oh.
that was great. That was
As always,
perfect.
yeah.
Very good.